Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator from Upshur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I guess, and if I missed this because I walked in, but I think you just got started when I walked in, so I'm not totally sure. But do you think a 6-year-old ought to have access to this kind of material?
Absolutely not, Senator.
Okay. And you indicated, I believe, to a question from the Senator from Harrison, that you think if there is any type of an affirmative step required, that that's too much.
That would be the essence of the holding from Ashcroft v. ACLU, and that would certainly be our position as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's true, but I think that that's what you said.
That's
right?
correct.
That's your position, whatever the court's position might be.
That would be our position, that for the state to put a blanket restriction on that speech and then make people take an affirmative step to go back and reaffirm what is a basic right is not the least restrictive
Is it a basic
means.
right for a 6-year-old?
It's not a basic right for a 6-year-old. It's a basic right of speech that can be.
It's a basic right of a 60-year-old, probably, not a 6-year-old.
Again, the assumption would be the speech is a right and it can be restricted. So you start with the right of speech and that can be restricted appropriately.
Is it appropriate, for example, to require an adult who wants to go see an adult movie in an adult theater to show ID?
Absolutely.
Is that an affirmative step?
Well, again, this isn't a blanket restriction that...
It's a blanket restriction that nobody under the age of 18 is allowed in that theater.
Right.
And then they have to take an affirmative step. Is that not an affirmative step, that they have to actually get in their pocket, have a driver's license or some other form of identification, show that? That's an affirmative step, isn't it? It doesn't cost any money, but it is an affirmative step. They have to go out of their way to do it, right?
That is correct. You could frame it that way.
And if I go into a convenience store where virtually every state in the country requires that the same types of magazines, as one might find material in such a theater, but those magazines can't be kept in a location where a person under the age of 18 can have access to them. Is that the case?
Right. Again, there would be a step someone has to take.
So there's an affirmative step, is my point.
Right.
So, and the courts have upheld these affirmative steps, right?
In something where it is broadly accessible to the public. But again, what they found...
Are you saying cell phones are not broadly accessible to the public?
They have, but when you look at Internet access, what the court has held in really the big case on this, and again, we've got to go back to Ashcroft v. ACLU, is that putting that restriction out there and making people go forward and say, and take a filter off every device, and that would be every computer, every tablet, every laptop, is not the least restrictive way to do this. When you're talking about walking into a store where that stuff is going to be readily available, putting a bar over it is...
I think you kind of implied that, or maybe I'm sorry if it was someone earlier said this, but that having the parent be responsible for blocking this content, in your view, is that correct?
That's correct. That would be a much less restrictive way.
And so, again, couldn't a parent do the same thing in the convenience store, not allow their kids to go in there, for example, not allow them into the magazine section of the store, for example? Couldn't we have said, parents, if you don't want your kids going into the 7-Eleven and finding this kind of material, it's your job to keep them away from it?
That's an argument that could be made. Again,
but the courts didn't find that argument was reasonable, did they?
In that particular instance, they didn't, because those are readily available when you walk into the store. It's not kept in a separate section.
And these are fairly readily available in today's society, aren't they? Cell phones, other internet accessible devices. I mean, virtually any tablet out there is either going to be an Apple or an Android tablet, very accessible. We have free Wi-Fi here in the Capitol. Somebody pointed out earlier, by the way, I've not really done a heavy-duty search that way, but I do know that we filter, because I can't browse things as simple as, Facebook without going through a proxy in this Capitol building. So we filter here. We filter in our schools. We filter in our public libraries. Everywhere that internet is freely and easily accessible to the public, for the most part, we seem to be filtering already, except cell phones.
Right, and the courts have actually...
And tablets, I should say.
And the court, well, and as I would read the language of this bill, any electronic device that gives you access to the internet, so that would be any computer, would potentially have to have this sort of blocking device on it. Again, what I would distinguish is, if you go into a general place of commerce, so if you walk into a convenience store and there's magazines right there, you may not be trying to seek out that particular material, but it would be right there and readily available. That's different than on the internet, where you have to go to a specific website that has this sort of material, in the same way that if you were walking into a video store that had a, for example, adults-only restricted section.
Do you
have
think
to go seek it out?
The average adult has the technical capacity to restrict their kids' access to this stuff on a cell phone, on a computer, et cetera?
I'm not going to be able to speak for the average adult. I think that
Well,
most people
I think we
will.
have to speak for the average adult because you're saying that it's a parent's responsibility to do this, not a provider's responsibility to do it, and therefore implied within that statement is the parent's ability to do this.
Right, and if the parents are going to take that step of providing their children with this internet access, then their responsibility is to have to put that on if they choose to.
Should we restrict then, based on what you just said, the sale of all internet connectable devices to adults?
No, I don't think we should.
Okay, so parents don't even necessarily have the ability to know what their kids own, do they?
No.
I mean, you can buy a cell phone, as oftentimes referred to as a burner phone, that has internet access. Your parent may not even know you have that phone.
That's correct.
So your parent would have no way of stopping you from accessing this content, would they?
That's correct. And in fact, again, when
And
you
this
go,
is something you legally go by in a store. I mean,
Yeah.
let's just say a lot of us in this room might have seen a girly magazine once or twice whenever they were a kid, and their parents didn't know about that, but we couldn't just go into any store and buy one, right?
That's correct.
So there's a difference between how it was obtained and what we're talking about here is obtained through legitimate sources. Today, a kid under the age of 18, in fact, I don't think there's any age limit. A kid of 6 or 7 years old could literally go into Walmart, buy a burner phone if he happened to have that much cash, pretty big paper route, whatever, and immediately have access with no ability for their parent to restrict that access.
Well, but again, that's the responsibility of the parent to be monitoring what their kids are doing.
Well, they could say the same thing about why don't we just let them buy whatever magazines they want to buy, and if they buy the wrong magazines, we put that on their parents too.
Again, there's a difference. I would argue that there's a difference between a magazine, which is exclusive to this
I
content.
agree there's a
and-
difference because a magazine's probably got 100 pages and the internet's got 1 billion.
And many of those are not indecent. And so again, if you're saying that there's going to be a
Well, a
blanket
lot of
law-
people only read Playboy for the articles.
So I've heard.
Yeah, that's what I hear. So the mere fact that there's lots of good content on the internet does not by any means preclude the idea that there's billions of pages on the internet that we don't want our kids going to. And not just necessarily purely what we call pornography. Could be Nazi websites, could be, jihad websites, who knows what. There might be lots of things on there we don't want our kids to have immediate access to.
Well, and you actually bring up a very good point there. There are a lot of things. Nazi websites and jihad websites should not be blocked as obscene, as court rulings are. So again, you're going to get into issues where that's something that would have to be parented. And again, when you're looking at the internet, when you're looking at something like that, we don't want to draw those sort of blanket.
Well, I think the
blanket blocks
difference
on
is
everyone.
that we broadly all agree we don't want our kids to see what we would think of as obscene.
Again, I think we can agree with that.
There may be some people who actually don't mind seeing Civil War statues.
Again, I won't disagree with that.
Okay. So we've established that the courts have determined that an affirmative step is okay.
In some circumstances, again,
Well,
when you're talking about internet,
Even in this, the decision I believe that we're talking about here, Ashcroft v. ACLU, says the primary alternative considered by the district court was blocking and filtering software. They suggested this.
right.
They suggested blocking and filtering software.
Well, but again, they suggested that as something that someone could go out and obtain themselves rather than a blanket.
Can you maybe sort of alert me to that? I'm looking at the paragraph here. I don't see where it says, and a parent should be the one to go out and buy the blocking and filtering software. I don't see that in this decision. Do you?
Well, and I don't have the decision in front of me, and they do not say that explicitly. Again, it's when you look at the law that was being blocked, what it was a blanket ban on access to certain websites. And again, what the court said is there shouldn't be that sort of blanket block where people then have to go forward and
Do you agree with the idea that these magazines in a store should be kept out of the reach of children? Forgetting about court cases. Do
Right.
you agree with that?
yes.
So you agree that there are times that we should move to protect children, even though it may cause an inconvenience to adults?
Absolutely.
I'm struggling to see where you draw a line here.
Again, I draw the line between saying that every single electronic device is going to have this blanket blocking software, which is not only necessarily going to block obscene content, but any blocking software I've ever seen has either inadvertently blocked legitimate content, which then means we're requiring people to take a affirmative step even to access stuff that's not obscene, or has allowed stuff through. So there's going to be issues there. And requiring that every device have this, and every single person who wants then to get around this has to take some
You know, if we
step
go
to
back just
remove.
briefly, sorry,
Yes.
to Playboy,
Right.
and the people who read it just for the articles.
Right.
Those articles wouldn't harm a 6-year-old, would they?
I'm sorry?
Those articles wouldn't necessarily harm a 6-year-old, would they?
Well, again, my understanding is some of those articles might.
Some might, some might not.
Right.
And so by blocking them from buying that magazine, aren't we blocking them from content that we really don't care if they observe?
Potentially we are.
Yeah. And so what's the real problem here whenever we might be blocking them from sites that we really don't care if they're blocked from as part of our goal, and the 99% is that we would be blocking 99% of the content that we would be blocking is content that we definitely don't want them to see. It may be that there's this small 1% that we wouldn't care about, much like with the Playboy magazine example. That article that's on the back page, I think, or maybe that's AOP magazine, I really don't know, but the article that's on the back page is probably tamer than most of it. We wouldn't really care about. We're blocking that 1% if we don't let them buy that magazine. In this case, though, it's not acceptable to block the 1% whenever we have this 99% that we don't want them to see.
Again, I would draw the distinction between something where you are blocking. I think we're going to take it out of the 6-year-old. And again, what we're going to do is we've got to look at an adult.
No, as an adult, what we know is that there's no question there may or may not be a fee in the end. But what we know is an adult could go in, buy the cell phone, and say, hey, while I'm here at the point of sale, remove this filter. And if there's a fee, they pay it. If there's not a fee, they don't pay it. But at that point, the adult has full access to everything. And so that's not really a whole lot different, is it, than going in and saying, can you get that magazine from that high shelf up there? I mean, I'm an IT guy, actually, and I can tell you, returning to the beginning question where I started, which was the average person has no idea about this stuff. I can tell you as an IT guy with 8 kids that over the years I've tried a lot of different stuff because stuff that works today doesn't work tomorrow.
And again, that's one of the practical.
So parents don't have an alternative. As an IT guy, I can tell you there are no great alternatives out there to block this content. So whenever you put the burden back on parents, first, they don't have the technical capability. Second, even whenever they do have the technical capability, things don't get sustained. But
well, and that would be a pragmatic concern that we would have about this anyway. Is exactly that this sort of blocking hasn't proven to be particularly good or effective anyways.
Well, but we can say the same thing again about magazines because we know kids wind up with some of those magazines anyway. So the methodology is not perfect, but we're not going for perfect, we're going for pretty good.
Right, and again, all I can tell you when you're looking at that and you're saying that yes, there's got to be this, whether it's point of sale or something else, to put that burden on every electronic device. This would be the for example I'd give you would be to go to convenience store and every magazine, you would have to say, hey, I want to make sure that if there's anything that happens to be in this magazine, I'm allowed to get it. That would be the best analogy I could give you. It's not just accessing this particular adult content magazine. It is.
I don't know if I would agree with that because every magazine you can go in there and buy, with the exception of just a few magazines that you have to say, I would like to have that magazine, and then somebody has to hand it to you. In this particular case, 99% of the internet would be available to you. And the only parts that wouldn't be available to you are these particular parts that we're talking about, in which case you might have to say, hey, can you hand me that content on the internet by disabling this filter right at the point of sale?
And again, I understand what you're saying there. I'm going to go back to Ashcroft first, and then I'm going to explain this in more broad context. In Ashcroft, they talk about that, and they talk about, again, it not being the least restrictive means when you're looking at that balancing test, to go and to have to identify yourself, and to, even if it's not being kept, and to say, I would like to do this. In a similar way, if you're talking about this, access magazines, drawing the comparison to a convenience store, we don't. See, I'm struggling to give you the best analogy here, but we don't want to over blanket say this is going to be an additional step that you have to do on the off chance that someone might wind up accessing this material.
Yeah, I understand the sort of the argument there, but let me ask you, and you maybe you'll have the answer because I don't know that it's necessarily an easy answer to have, but you know, the filters that I'm familiar with probably do a 99% job, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And not having the filter means there is no filter. So having the filter on your phone means that, yes, it's not perfect, but it's about 99%, especially if it's maintained, which by definition in this legislation it would be maintained. So a 99% fix, or show an ID and it's 100%, you can have whatever you want. That seems to you to be far too restrictive on.
When you're talking about restricting First Amendment rights, then yes, compared to other less restrictive means, for example, a parent going out and saying, I want to make sure my kid doesn't have access to this, I'm going to download this app, I'm going to make sure my kid, I'm monitoring my kid. Yes, that is less restrictive, and that is what the courts say is find the least restrictive way to do it.
Are you familiar with any applications that can be installed on an Android phone that hasn't been rooted that can't be removed?
I'm not, but I haven't had to explore that just yet.
I can tell you from a technical perspective, there aren't any. In other words, a parent does not currently have the technical ability to install an app on an Android phone that can't be removed by the child. Or are you aware of that?
I'm not.
Okay, because that's the whole point of having root access to your phone is that you then have what's called super user access. Basically, you're an admin on your phone. Almost none of the manufacturers through the major brands, Verizon, AT&T, et cetera, sell rooted phones. Therefore, a parent doesn't even have the technical capability, even if they have the technical knowledge, to install a filter on a phone that a child cannot remove.
Okay.
So what do they do now?
Again, that's where we tell parents you have to be monitoring what your children do. We say this in a lot of different and
you provide them with no way to do what you say that they ought to do.
in much the same example you brought up, you know, children do get access to content that they shouldn't get otherwise.
And parents try to block that. I can tell you as a parent, I've continuously
Sure.
tried to make
well,
sure that that's
I'm not
the
talking
case.
about internet content. I'm talking about, you know, printed material. It's not, no parent can absolutely stop that. But what we don't want to do is put such a blanket restriction on society on people's ability to access that we're
So no parent can stop it.
right.
Apple phones apparently have it. I'm not an Apple guy, so I won't claim for sure that they do, but I've heard that they do. They already put it on the phone. Apple can turn it on and off for you. So on an Apple phone, you can do what we're talking about. On an Android phone, you generally can't do what we're talking about. We have filters that could be installed by someone who does have root access that would be 99% accurate, but you think that that's too heavy of a blanket that they might miss the 1% of the content?
I think it's too heavy of a blanket to say that we're going to begin with the presumption that everyone will be blocked, and the people again have to go and ask and identify themselves and request that this be removed on every again electronic device.
Isn't every magazine in America blocked by being put behind a screen so that a child can't see it, and we're making people go in and ask and even prove ID to get that magazine?
Yes, but again, I would draw a difference between if I walk into a convenience store and I can go to a magazine rack and lift a magazine out from behind that barrier and walk up to the cashier. Again, they may ask me to flash my ID as I'm walking out. I don't
Isn't
have to
that
sign
all they're asking for here, though?
I don't have to sign any sort of statement. I don't have to.
I think I could be wrong in
Again,
this
pay
bill.
pay any fee as it's written now.
Well, the fee, that's a separate question, and
Right.
I want to sort of make sure we keep that in mind.
Right.
But absent the fee, isn't what we're talking about is they flash their ID and somebody punches in a quick code and boom, it's done.
Again,
Probably as long as it takes to punch in the numbers on the magazine or scan it with a barcode reader and take your money, and that same kind of a line item speed, they can remove the filter off of the phone by simply flashing the ID. I'm pretty sure it doesn't require any written consent or anything. I think that was taken out, so there's not like a record created. There's no paper trail. You just show your ID. They take the filter off the phone.
Again, but to create such a blanket block, I do think there's a difference between saying that we're going to start with an assumption that all this content is going to be blocked and people have to go in and say, I want access to all of this, and a difference between doing that and going specifically for one particular magazine, one particular piece of printed material and saying, I'm getting this. Saying a whole field of material is going to be blanket blocked and you either get access or you don't get access. I do think that there is a significant difference there.
It would seem to me like it's actually in favor of the person who wants to view the content, because if I'm going into a store to get a magazine, and then I go in the next day to get another magazine, and I go in the next day to get another magazine, and so on, and each time I'm actually carded to make sure that I'm old enough to buy that magazine, whereas with this, it's a one-time deal. I show my ID one time, and then I get access to all of the magazines for the rest of my life.
I can see what you're saying.
So this actually seems like a lower burden than the magazine in the store, because it's a one-time deal.
I can see what you're saying there. Again, our underlying principle on this would be that when you're starting with the presumption that all of this is blocked for everyone.
But the magazines are all blocked for everyone until you demonstrate that you're old enough to buy the magazine.
A magazine it's on public display, they're going to block it that would be obscene, that would be publicly displayed, and they're going to ask for some sort of age verification, as every website that's got obscene material does too. They're going to ask for some sort of verification.
In there. Thanks. Thank you, Mr.